We're joined now by Pat Buchanan. I would never put Pat Buchanan off for anyone except the president, and I know he understands that. Hey, Pat, how are you?
Been put off by presidents before. That's quite an interview. I guess he's been talking to the King of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, we have to get into this Khashoggi situation. Again, he walks into his consulate in Turkey, and he doesn't come out. Okay, so looks like something happened, got chopped up or something. We don't know what happened, but of course he wrote a column in a Saudi-owned Arab newspaper that was canceled. You know, the guy's marriage was collapsing at one point, and he's an Islamist. Even the New York Times today said, look, the guy's an Islamist, but also had in the past royal service. Now, it doesn't mean he should be killed. But there are people out there who seem to want us to go to war over a person, like a person being killed or snuffed out in someone else's consulate. I mean, how does that make any sense, Pat?
Well, this is a classic case of the question of morality versus state interest. Khashoggi is from everything we know, Khashoggi went in there. They brought in a forensic expert from Saudi Arabia with a bone saw, and he didn't come out. And you had 15 guys go in on 2 planes and come out the same day.
Yep.
And the Turks have a lot of tapes and videos, they claim, and we've got some information that the Prince of Saudi Arabia was trying to lure him back to Saudi Arabia for some beneficent purpose. But the key thing here today is you've got the Prince of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, and the King put the credibility of Saudi Arabia on the line that they did not do this. And so you've got America's checking it out. And at the same time as this looks like a real atrocity and a moral atrocity, at the same time there are very serious state interests in U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia. So you've got to balance those things out. I remember, Richard Nixon, and we're over there in China toasting Mao Zedong at the same time they're going through the massacres of the great proletarian cultural revolution because we needed to deal with the Chinese against the Russians in the Cold War. It's a real conflict here between morality and state interest, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, but it's undeniable that Donald Trump believes he is acting in the best interest, cold national interest of the United States.
Marco Rubio, someone who, is much more of a neoconservative, vilifying Russia on occasion with other Republicans, not vilifying, but just I think acts like Russia is sometimes a bigger threat than it is. Even though he's been fantastic actually lately on China, Rubio's been great. This is what he said about Saudi Arabia yesterday.
We've already asked for a Magnitsky investigation, which means individuals responsible for that decision would be sanctioned. Beyond that, there are other options that we can take. Like I said, that's something that needs to be thought through carefully, but it needs to be very strong and meaningful. It can't be symbolic. It can't just be words.
Your reaction to that?
I do agree with Senator Rubio to this extent. You can't just brush this off. If the investigation points to the Crown Prince, and the Crown Prince, I don't know how you make the future leader of Saudi Arabia persona non grata and impose sanctions on him personally. Say he can't come to the United States and seize his bank accounts or something like that. So you got a real conundrum here. So I think what's going to happen is the Saudis are now working with the Turks. And the Turks, a lot of countries over there in the Middle East have a real vested interest in not having a breach between Saudi Arabia and the United States. So again, Laura, you're going to see these interests of ours against the sort of the moral position you got to take, which is this is an outrage, it can't be allowed to happen, and it's got to be punished by sanctions at least against the individuals. Someone suggested that the solution is going to be the inevitable rogue agents went and did something they weren't supposed to do.
And they wanted to give the Crown Prince deniability, right?
I mean, this is in...
Wink, wink.
Exactly. Wink, wink, exactly. Again, when I was considering running against George H.W. Bush, remember the Tiananmen massacre in Tiananmen Square? It was just a couple of months later that Scowcroft and Eagleburger were over there toasting them. So, you had the state interest in the relations with China. At the same time, you could not condone what they had done to a democratic uprising in Tiananmen Square. I mean, we've gone down through history one after another of these, and again, it's a conflict between the state and the state and morality.
Well, and just another fact, and we'll move on, Pat. Khashoggi, we talked about this or touched on this last week, was an acquaintance of bin Laden's going back decades. And that was his
bin
first.
Ladens are a big family in Saudi Arabia,
right.
Yeah. Exactly.
So that's the big, claim to fame. And he, on Twitter,
after Brotherhood as well.
Yeah, exactly. And after his, after bin Laden was killed in 2011, the Khashoggi basically mourned his death while saying, I'm basically using his nickname on Twitter and saying, I collapsed crying a while ago. Heartbroken for you, Abu Abdullah, which was the nickname for bin Laden. And he said, you were beautiful and brave in those days in Afghanistan before you surrendered to hatred and passion. It's going
to somewhat diminish the grief over Khashoggi's death when all that stuff gets out. And that'll be another part of this whole thing, I think, is the steady demonization of Khashoggi, or maybe painting a realistic picture of what the Saudis are dealing with here that doesn't justify murder but does mitigate the hostility of the Saudi crown prince and the Saudi regime for Khashoggi.
Yeah, and also,
this here is going to divide us, I think.
Right.
You take the journalists immediately pulled out of this conference this week, whereas Trump has left so far, I think. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has gone to the conference.
Yeah, this future investment initiative.
Davos in the desert.
Right.
I wasn't that fond of the original Davos.
Our kind of people, Pat. All right, Pat.
I wasn't invited.
Pat, we're going to take a break and then bring you back over after the commercial break so we can have a little bit more time with you. The president rudely took up some of our time with Pat Buchanan. We'll take a break, get out very quickly here, be right back. Hold it there.
That same old crowd was like a cold, dark cloud that we could never rise above.
In retrospect, do you think Bill should have resigned in the wake of the Monica Lewinsky scandal?
Absolutely not.
It wasn't an abuse of power?
No.
There are people who look at the incidents of the 90s and they say a president of the United States cannot have a consensual relationship with an intern. The power imbalance is too great.
Who was an adult.
Oh, that's the new rule. Okay, now I really understand modern day feminism. Pat Buchanan returns with us here on the Laura Ingraham Show. Pat, I have to have you tee off on this. So Hillary now writes the new rules for today's left-wing feminists.
Well, how old was she? 22?
Yeah, and F that.
Well, yep. But what else? She's in a box. What else is she going to say? No, he shouldn't resign. I guess she goes along with the 50 senators in the impeachment hearing who voted, maybe guilty, but we're not going to remove him. So, but I think, that's Hillary's position.
Pat, let's talk about where we are with the midterms here. It looks like in key races. In the Senate side, at least, Tennessee is moving from a toss-up to leans GOP. Texas moves from toss-up to leans GOP, despite the fact that Beto O'Rourke is got $35 million from outside people. What Texans aren't that blue yet?
No, they're not that blue. But Beto might have a lot of money when the race is over, and he's running as though he's running nationally rather than in Texas with all these left positions. So that could be very interesting. You recall, I think Mr. Lincoln lost a Senate race in 1858, came back to win the presidency of the United States in 1860, although Beto hasn't quite risen to that level just yet.
Yeah, I don't know. I think people who, now the whole using the nickname, and his name is Robert Francis O'Rourke.
What did he adopted this apparently to reach the Hispanics in his district. It sounds more friendly to those folks down there.
Well, I think his mom or one of his family members called him that when he was a little boy, and maybe it was it's like Barack. He was Barry before he was Barack. I don't know. It's just like everyone's trying to be Obama. It's like nobody can be Reagan. Reagan was his own force of nature with his own history. So no one can be Reagan, and no one's going to be, no one's going to be Obama. He was his own.
Yep, and Reagan was the only one that played halfback for Notre Dame under the name the Gipper.
Yeah, absolutely.
George Gipp.
Oh my gosh, Pat! I just watched that scene of Newt Rockney the other night. The old win one for the Gipper.
It's a wonderful movie, isn't it?
Oh, I cry every time I look at that scene. I cry like the young vigor in Reagan, and oh no, I can't even watch that.
Reagan really desperately wanted that role too. I think he really fought to get it. George Gipp, he knew that, knew the story, and
all right,
and the
Pat,
romance of it all.
Yeah, Pat, we have a minute left. We now have a new series of caravans. This is what we call a bunch of people who want to violate U.S. immigration laws from Guatemala and Honduras, making their way up from those countries to the U.S. border. Is this a challenge for the president or an opportunity for more development and growth of this base?
Well, I think it is. I think it's a real opportunity for the president. And look, we're going to have more of these. The West is going to have a lot more of them. I think he's got to deal with them, and I think he ought to talk to the Mexican government and say, look, what are you doing, providing access to these folks coming up to our border, intending to cross it and break our laws? We've got to deal with NAFTA, a new NAFTA, so to speak, or a post-NAFTA. And so we'd like your help, and I think the president's got to stop these or they're going to be coming forever.
Exactly. Pat, you took the words out of my mouth. Need Congress to act, and you need the president to step up. I appreciate it. Pat Buchanan, no one like him. Thank you so much.